He arrived bearing candy and cigarettes for the POWs. He smiled and made pleasant conversation, posed for photographs with British officers, and spoke admiringly of America and Britain. For several days he raised not a ripple. On a Sunday morning, Watanabe approached some POWs crowded in a barracks doorway. A POW named Derek Clark piped up, "Gangway!" to clear a path. That one word sent Watanabe into an explosion. He lunged at Clark, beat him until he fell down, then kicked him. As Bush tried to explain that Clark had meant no harm, Watanabe drew his sword and began screaming that he was going to behead Clark. A Japanese officer stopped the attack, but that evening Watanabe turned on Bush, hurling him onto a scalding stove, then pummeling and kicking him. After Bush went to bed, Watanabe returned and forced him to his knees. For 3 hours, Watanabe besieged Bush, kicking him and hacking off his hair with his sword. He left for 2 hours, then returned again. Bush expected to be murdered. Instead, Watanabe took him to his office, hugged him, and gave him beer and handfuls of candy and cigarettes. Through tears, he apologized and promised never to mistreat another POW. His resolution didn't last. Later that night, he picked up a kendo stick, a long, heavy training sword, and ran shrieking into a barracks, clubbing every man he saw. Watanabe had, in Bush's words, shown his hand. From that day on, both his victims and his fellow Japanese would ponder his violent, erratic behavior and disagree on its cause. To Yuichi Hato, the camp accountant, it was simply madness. Others saw something calculating. After Watanabe attacked Clark, POW officers who had barely noticed him began looking at him with terror. The consequence of his outburst answered a ravening desire. Raw brutality gave him sway over men that his rank did not. He suddenly saw after he hit a few men that he was feared and respected for that, said Wade, and so that became his style of behavior. Watanabe derived another pleasure from violence. According to Hato, Watanabe was a sexual sadist, freely admitting that beating prisoners brought him to climax. He did enjoy hurting POWs, wrote Hato. He was satisfying his sexual desire by hurting them. A tyrant was born. Watanabe beat POWs every day, fracturing their windpipes, rupturing their eardrums, shattering their teeth, tearing one man's ear half off, leaving men unconscious. He made one officer sit in a shack, wearing only a fundoshi undergarment, for 4 days in winter. He tied a 65-year-old POW to a tree and left him there for days. He ordered one man to report to him to be punched in the face every night for 3 weeks. He practiced judo on an appendectomy patient. When gripped in the ecstasy of an assault, he wailed and howled, drooling and frothing, sometimes sobbing, tears running down his cheeks. Men came to know when an outburst was imminent. Watanabe's right eyelid would sag a moment before he snapped. Very quickly, Watanabe gained a fearsome reputation throughout Japan. Officials at other camps began sending troublesome prisoners to Watanabe for polishing, and Omori was dubbed punishment camp. In the words of Commander Mar, who had been transferred from Ofuna to become the ranking Omori POW, Watanabe was the most vicious guard in any prison camp on the main island of Japan. 2 things separated Watanabe from other notorious war criminals. One was the emphasis that he placed on emotional torture. Even by the standards of his honor-conscious culture, he was unusually consumed by his perceived humiliation and was intent upon inflicting the same pain on the men under his power. Where men like the Quack were simply goons, Watanabe combined beatings with acts meant to batter men's psyches. He forced men to bow at pumpkins or trees for hours. He ordered a clergyman POW to stand all night saluting a flagpole, shouting the Japanese word for salute, kere. The experience left the man weeping and out of his mind. He confiscated and destroyed POW's family photographs and brought men to his office to show them letters from home, then burned the unopened letters in front of them. To ensure that men felt utterly helpless, He changed the manner in which he demanded to be addressed each day, beating anyone who guessed wrong. He ordered men to violate camp policies, then attacked them for breaking the rules. POW Jack Brady summed him up in one sentence: he was absolutely the most sadistic man I ever met. The other attribute that separated Watanabe from fellow guards was his inconsistency. Most of the time he was the wrathful god of Omori, but after beatings he sometimes returned to apologize, often in tears. These fits of contrition usually lasted only moments before the shrieking and punching began again. He would spin from serenity to raving madness in the blink of an eye, usually for no reason. One POW recalled seeing him gently praise a POW, fly into a rage and beat the POW unconscious, then amble to his office and eat his lunch with the placidity of a grazing cow. When Watanabe wasn't thrashing POWs, he was forcing them to be his buddies. He'd wake a POW in the night and be nice as pie, asking the man to join him in his room where he'd serve cookies and talk about literature. Sometimes he'd round up anyone in camp who could play an instrument or sing, bring them to his room, and host a concert. He expected the men to respond as if they adored him, and at times he seemed to honestly believe that they did. Maybe he held these gatherings because they left the POWs feeling more stressed than if he were consistently hostile. Or maybe he was lonely. Among the January was his wealth and his curtness. He made a great show of his education, droning on about nihilism and giving pompous lectures on French literature at NCO meetings. None of his colleagues listened. It wasn't the subject matter. It was simply that they loathed him. Perhaps this is why he turned to POWs for friendship. The tea parties, wrote Derek Clark, were tents, sitting on the edge of a volcano of fairs. Any misstep, any misunderstood word might set Watanabe off, leaving him smashing teapots, upending tables, and pounding his guests into oblivion. After the POWs left, Watanabe seemed to feel humiliated by having had to force friendship from lowly POWs. The next day he would often deliver a wild-eyed whipping to the previous night's buddies. Like any bully, he had a taste for a particular type of victim. Enlisted men usually received only the occasional slapped face. Officers were in for unrelenting cruelty. Among those officers, a few were especially irresistible to him. Some had elevated status, such as physicians, chaplains, barracks commanders, and those who'd been highly successful in civilian life. Others he resented because they wouldn't crawl before him. These he singled out and hunted with inexhaustible hatred. From the moment that Watanabe locked eyes with Louis Zamperini, an officer, a famous Olympian, and a man for whom defiance was second nature, no man obsessed him more.